An existent cannot be stripped of its being. Being is the ever-present foundation of the existent. It is everywhere in it and nowhere. There is no being that is not the being of a certain mode of being, none which cannot be apprehended through the mode of being which manifests being and veils it at the same time. Consciousness can always pass beyond the existent, not toward its being, but toward the meaning of this being. The meaning of the being of the existent, insofar as it reveals itself to consciousness, is the phenomenon of being. This meaning has itself a being based on which it manifests itself. The phenomenon of being is not being, but indicates being and requires it. The phenomenon of being, like every primary phenomenon, is immediately disclosed to consciousness. We have at each instant a pre-ontological comprehension of it, that is one that is not accompanied by a fixing in concepts and elucidation. For us at present, then, there is no question of considering this phenomenon for the sake of trying to fix the meaning of being. We must observe always, number one, that this elucidation of the meaning of being is valid only for the being of the phenomenon. Since the being of consciousness is radically different, its meaning will necessitate a particular elucidation in terms of the revealed revelation of another type of being for itself, l'être pour soi, which will define later, and which is opposed to the being in itself, l'être en soi, of the phenomenon. Number two, that the elucidation of the meaning of being in itself, which we are going to attempt here, can only be provisional. The aspects which will be revealed imply other significations which ultimately we must apprehend and determine. In particular, the preceding reflections have permitted us to distinguish two absolutely separate regions of being, the being of the pre-reflective cogito and the being of the phenomenon. But although the concept of being has this peculiarity of being divided into two regions without communication, we must nevertheless explain how these two regions can be placed under the same heading. That will necessitate the investigation of these two types of being, and it is evident that we cannot truly grasp the meaning of either one until we can establish their true connection with the notion of being in general and the relations which unite them. We have indeed established that the being of the phenomenon can on no account act upon consciousness. In this way, we have ruled out a realistic conception of the relations of the phenomenon with consciousness. We have shown also that consciousness cannot get out of its subjectivity if the latter has been initially given, and that consciousness cannot act upon transcendent being nor without contradiction admit of the passive elements necessary in order to constitute a transcendent being arising from them. Thus we have ruled out an idealist solution of the problem. Being is itself. This means that it is neither passivity nor activity. Both of these notions are human and designate human conduct or the instruments of human conduct. There is activity when a conscious being uses means with an end in view, and we call these objects passive on which our activity is exercised, inasmuch as they do not spontaneously aim at the end which we make them serve. In a word, man is active and the means which he employs are called passive. These concepts, but absolutely, lose all meaning. In particular, being is not active. In order for there to be ends and means, there must be being. For an even stronger reason, it cannot be passive. For in order to be passive, it must be. The self-consistency of being is beyond the active as it is beyond the passive. Being is equally beyond negation as beyond affirmation. Affirming is always affirmation of something. That is, the act of affirming is distinguished from the thing affirmed. But if we suppose an affirmation in which the affirmed comes to fulfill the affirming and is confused with it, this affirmation cannot be affirmed. It is there that we find being, in connection with the consciousness. It is the inherence in itself without the least difference. From this point of view, we should not call it immanence, for immanence, in spite of all connection with the self, is still that very slight withdrawal which can be realized, away from the self. But being is not a connection with itself. It is itself. It is an immanence which cannot realize itself, an affirmation which cannot affirm itself, an activity which cannot act, because it is glued to itself. Everything happens as if, in order to free the affirmation of self from the heart of being, there is necessary a decompression of being. Let us not, however, think that being is merely one undifferentiated self-affirmation. The indifferentiation of the in itself is beyond an infinity of self-affirmations, inasmuch as there is an infinity of modes of self-affirming. We may summarize by saying that being is in itself. But if being is in itself, this means that it does not refer to itself as self-consciousness does. It is this self. It is itself so completely that the perpetual reflection which constitutes a self is dissolved in an identity. That is why being is at bottom beyond the self. In fact, being is opaque to itself precisely because it is filled with itself. This can be better expressed by saying that being is what it is. Actually, it is far from being reduced to that principle of identity which is the unconditioned principle of all analytical judgments. First, the formula designates a particular region of being, that of being in itself. We shall see that the being of for itself is defined, on the contrary, by being what it is not and not being what it is. The question here, then, is of a regional principle. Furthermore, it is necessary to oppose this formula, being in itself is what it is, to that which designates the being of the consciousness. From the moment that beings exist who have to be what they are, the problem of being what they are is no longer a purely axiomatic characteristic. It is a contingent principle of being in itself. In this sense, the principle of identity, the principle of analytical judgments, is also a synthetical principle of being. It designates the opacity of being in itself. This opacity has nothing to do with our position in relation to the in itself. It is not that we are obliged to apprehend it and to observe it because we are without. Being in itself has no within, which is opposed to a without, and which is analogous to a judgment, a law, a consciousness of itself. The in itself has nothing secret. It is solid. In a sense, we can designate it as a synthesis. But it is the most indissoluble of all, the synthesis of itself with itself. The result is evidently that being is isolated in its being and that it does not enter into any connection with what is not itself. It is what it is. This means that by itself it cannot even be what it is not. We have seen indeed that it can encompass no negation. It is full positivity. It knows no otherness. It never posits itself as other than another being. It can support no connection with the other. It is itself indefinitely and it exhausts itself in being. From this point of view, we shall see later that it is not subject to temporality. It is, and when it gives way, one cannot even say that it no longer is. Or at least, a consciousness can be conscious of it as no longer being, precisely because consciousness is temporal. But being itself does not exist as a lack there where it was. The full positivity of being is reformed on its giving way. It was, and at present other things are. That is all. Finally, this will be our third characteristic. Being in itself is. This means that being can neither be derived from the possible nor reduced to the necessary. An existing phenomenon can never be derived from another existent qua existent. This is what we shall call the contingency of being in itself. But neither can be in itself be derived from a possibility. The possible is a structure of the for itself. That is, it belongs to the other region of being. Being in itself is never either possible or impossible. It is. This is what consciousness expresses by saying that being is superfluous. That is, that consciousness absolutely cannot derive from being anything, either from another being, or from a possibility, or from a necessary law. Uncreated, without reason for being, without any connection to another being in itself is de trop for eternity. Being is in itself, being is what it is. These are the three characteristics which the preliminary examination of the phenomenon of being allows us to assign the being of the phenomena. For the moment, it is impossible for us to push our investigation further.